So some people seem to be trying to get it retracted for reasons that aren't entirely clear. Dr. Speaker says there's teams analysing every sort of jot and tittle in the paper to try and find some justification to get it taken down, rather than debating the actual content of what it's saying. So that was disappointing before we even start looking at the science. So the vaccine vials are from pharmacists, including the XBB 1.5. So these are vaccine vials here that is collected. And they're analysing the amount of DNA contamination in these vials. And if we just look at that, maybe look at that top graph there in some more detail, we see that these are all the different vials. They've all got DNA contamination. Now, this was the old level of contamination that was allowed. This is the new level of contamination that's allowed. But of course, this is a log scale, so that's 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000. So basically now 1,000 times more DNA contamination is allowed than used to be allowed. Maybe more on that in a minute. So the DNA contamination in the Pfizer vials was 36 to 153 times that which was allowed by the regulations. That's not 153%, that's 153 times, 153-fold for the Pfizer. 36 to 153. With the Moderna, it was 112 to 627-fold. So huge amounts of DNA contamination compared to that which is allowed. And it looks like the Australian and Irish vials had even more DNA contamination. And the fact that the amount of DNA contamination varies in various places around the world means that the manufacturing process is clearly inconsistent. All Pfizer vials had SV40 DNA sequence, 500 billion, that's right, 500 billion copies of SV40 sequence per vial. Now, the thing about this SV40 sequence is, this SV40 sequence of DNA comes from something called the Simian Virus. But this SV40 sequence codes for a protein, and that protein inhibits the activity of P53, which is a human tumour suppressor gene. So if you're making a protein that's inhibiting the activity of the tumour suppressor gene, that tumour suppressor gene is no longer going to inhibit the tumours, therefore the tumours will be freer to grow. So that's a particular concern, and 500 billion copies of that SV40 promoter sequence per vial. Quite appalling levels of contamination, I think you would agree. The sequences that are there, he considers that the fact that there's so many sequences there make genomic integration more likely. So he said it's a bit like a shotgun or a shrapnel effect. The fact that there's so many DNA contaminations, it means that integration into the host genome, that's the human genome where it will cause a mutation, become more likely. Many DNA fragments, shotgun shrapnel effect. Small chunks can be spontaneously integrated into human DNA. And any that is integrated into human DNA will change human DNA. Therefore, that is a mutation, and mutations can cause cancer. The data we have so far is from VAERS, but David is concerned about more cancer cases, particularly going on for years, decades, and he's also concerned about harm to the human germline, that this could affect sperm cells, for example. We're not going to really know that for another generation, but there could be a generational effect. Now, normally I would think that's a bit scaremongering, but this is coming from a DNA scientist, so we have to take that warning seriously. Now, this allowance for the amount of DNA contamination, it was increased from this relatively low amount. I think that was in 1996, that was changed by the World Health Organization. It was increased to this much higher amount. So you can see by the old criteria, all the vials are exceeding it. And quite a few are even by the newer, more lenient criteria. But the problem here is that these guidelines were designed for naked DNA and vaccines. So if you just inject, so if you've got your vaccine antigen and you've got some naked DNA, that's just DNA fragments just floating around in solution, that's naked DNA, then that's going to go into the blood. It's going to be got rid of by the body's natural defense systems, and very little of it will transfect, that is, go into cells, because the DNA is essentially water soluble. It's not going to go through the fatty cell membranes. So these allowances that we see here, these allowances were for naked DNA, which is remarkably inefficiently transfected across cell membranes into our human cells. But of course now it's in lipid nanoparticles, and the lipid nanoparticles carry the DNA contamination directly into our cells. So the fact that this DNA is now in lipid nanoparticles means that, I don't know, it's maybe 1,000 times easier, maybe 10,000 times easier for the DNA to get into our cells. Therefore, the limit should have gone down by 1,000 or 10,000 times rather than up by 1,000 times. That we should have a much more stringent requirement for lack of DNA contamination than we have, because it's transfected so readily. So the fact that this is above regulatory amounts is only a very small part of the story, because those regulatory amounts are designed for naked DNA. Now it's in lipid nanoparticles, and a tiny amount of DNA is going to transfect, get into our cells so much more readily than it did when the DNA was just naked in previous generations of vaccines. This is a real effect that simply hasn't been taken into account. So David's pretty convinced that there's transfection into human cells. Now, spike protein, of course, has been found in people 700 days post vaccine integration. So David thinks that because the spike protein is there 700 days after vaccination, that's because information to make the spike protein has been integrated into the human genome. So he said that's likely evidence of integration into the human genome already. Where it is it in the heart? Is it in the lymph nodes? We don't know. But it looks like our own cells are producing it somehow. Now, it's also possible that the pseudouridine, which is put into the RNA vaccines, he said it makes the RNA rigid and plastic-like. It could be that that's hanging around for a long period of time. So he can't say for sure whether the spike protein that's there 700 days post-vaccine is due to genomic integration. He thinks it probably is, but it could also be due to the pseudouridine. Either way, of course, it's bad. But this could be evidence for integration into human genomes already. And there's also the frame shifting as a result of the pseudouridine, which is bad. Now, David got his results on DNA contamination through two completely separate methods. I'm not going to go into the details. I don't pretend to understand them, but he does. Two completely separate methods, and they both show these high levels of DNA contamination. Due to now the amount varies because the manufacturing processes have varied, as we've said. And he said that pharma does measure the mRNA in their completed products. It does measure the DNA in their completed products, but they use different methods to do that, which just seems utterly ridiculous. Utterly ridiculous. His work has been sworn in by Senator Ron Johnson as evidence for the US congressional record. So even if, I don't know, say vested interest does succeed in getting David Speaker's paper retracted, whatever the word is, taken down, it's still been submitted to the US Congress as evidence. David, like me, calls for a moratorium on all these mRNA vaccines. He calls for a halt. So many people vaccine injured already. Let's not have any more. And any future mRNA vaccines, we need a lot more data before we are convinced that they are safe and effective, because the current ones aren't. He also wants access to full data so that people can have freedom of choice.